Okay, so hi, a pleasant afternoon, everyone. So for whoever who is actually listening, or for whoever is actually um, viewing my discussion or my presentation for this time, so allow me to formally introduce myself. So by the way, my name is Giancarlo Gerald M. Templa, and I'm actually from the College of Education and currently a third year college student under by the English department. So for this time, I will actually be discussing about the 14 literary genres. So particularly to the introduction of those literary genres. So as what you actually see here, there are actually 14 literary genres. So first and foremost, before we actually proceed to the content of this one, so allow me first to define what is actually the title all about. What does it imply as for? Of course, when we talk about literary, when we hear the word literary, you only have to be reminded, or you just simply have to remind yourself that when you actually hear the word literary, it focuses with the literature itself. While when we talk about genres, it talks about the classifications, it talks about the varieties, or let me say, the dissimilarities or the differences of literary. So basically, when we talk about literary genres, basically the title itself, it talks about the classifications or the varieties of literatures. That's why it's called 14. So for this time, I will be discussing about what are those 14. So for the first one, we actually have here the literary fiction. So literary fiction novels are considered works with artistic value and literary merit. They often include political criticism, social commentary, and reflections on humanity. So literary fiction is actually different when it's actually being compared to the other ones, because basically we're just focusing to the meaning being provided here. Literary fiction, it has its value. That's why because a lot of books nowadays, yes, they may be expensive, but they do not have value at all. So any stories under by literary fiction are actually has its own value, artistic value, and at the same time with the merit. And for the second one, we actually also have here the mystery. So mystery novels, also called the detective fiction, follow a detective solving a case from start to finish. So all you have to remember when you actually hear the word mystery as one of the literary genres, mystery, it there is let me say there is this actually a problem that needs to be solved. That's why it's called mystery. That's why it's actually called detective fiction, because from the term itself, detective, it's actually an act of detecting. So when you talk about detecting, it's like you are finding something. It's like you are finding solutions to the answers, or it seems like you're actually looking for the probable solutions for the case. That's why it's called mystery. So mystery, it does not only happen in our everyday life, because in our world there are actually a lot of crime. So even in so many stories, even if mystery itself, it can be a story, but still it can also happen even through imagination. And also we also have here the thriller. So the thriller, all you have to remember when you hear the word thriller, it actually derived from the word thrill. So when we talk about thrill, it's synonymously with the word this suspense. So all of the events, all of the happenings that happen or that occur in the story, there is this actually a suspense. That's why it's actually called thriller. So just like also when you actually want to watch a movie, you're actually being thrilled. Yes, that's why it's actually called as an example of thriller. And also we also have here the horror. So I believe it's somewhat so understandable already on your part when you actually hear the word horror, because basically horror, it's all about something horrifying or something terrifying. So all you have to remember when you talk about horror, it's all about movies or stories that are actually scary. And also to the another genre, we also have here the historical. So historical fiction novels takes place in the past. So basically, when you hear the word historical, it also it also the same with the previous one, but I was able to elaborate because basically when we talk about historical, it's more on the history itself. So all you have, if horror, it talks about something scary. So historical, it talks about the history, or let me say the foundations or the happenings happened or occurred in the past. And also for the other one, for the other genre, I'm so sorry. So let's now proceed to the romance. So romance fiction centers around love stories between two people. They are lighthearted, optimistic, and have an emotionally satisfying ending. So we usually think that when we hear the word romance, it there is this love, but there will always be these partners, but we should not just only think about that. We shouldn't only think about when we hear the word romance, it's only about love. No, because just also to remind you that when we hear the word romance, it's not just only about the protagonist. It's not just only about the characters involved. So as well as there is this also this conflict that occurs even in, because just like also in life, it's not just only about happiness. We people, we citizens, we always encounter many challenges that measure our capacity as people. So just like also in the story, when we hear the word romance, so aside from there is this the presence of love, of two people loving each other, of course, there is also this conflict that needs to be resolved in order to have or to come up with a happy ending. And also for the other genre, we also have here the western. So I believe it's somewhat not so familiar for us. Even me personally, I'm not also this so much familiar with this. So when we hear the word western, if you will allow me to read some of the definitions of the western genre. So romantic fiction centers around love stories between two people, as what I actually mentioned earlier. They're that hard to have. Okay, so I am very much sorry if I believe I was not able to put here the exact definition of Western. So I'm very much sorry. But as far as I remember, when we talk about Western, of course, it talks about the lives, it talks about the histories, it talks about the cultures, the traditions of people living in West. So Western, of course, that's why it's actually called Western, because all of the events are actually all about people living in the West. And also for the other genre, we also have here the Bildungsroman. I believe it's somewhat so not so familiar with us, even in personally as well. So Bildungsroman, it is a literary genre of stories about a character growing psychologically and morally from their youth into adulthood. So Bildungsroman, in the shortest definition, it talks about the growing. It talks about the development. It talks about the growth of a character from child, from being an adolescent, from being teen, from being an early adult, being adult, until he or she becomes, yes, an old. So all you have to remember that when we actually hear the word Bildungsroman, it's more on about the growth, from being a baby, and yes, like it can be from being a baby, or from being, as what I actually said earlier, from being a baby or from being a kid, an infant or a toddler, until become reach the adolescent stage, and the early adult, the adult, and also with the old stage. And aside from Bildungsroman, we also have here the speculative fiction. So the stories takes place in a world different from our own. Speculative fiction knows no boundaries. There are no limits to what exists beyond the real world. So speculative fiction is somewhat like, let me say, on my part, I will say it's a kind of interesting, because aside if some of the stories, for example, what I actually mentioned earlier, like horror, and also with the Bildungsroman, most of the happenings are actually happening or actually occurring in the real world. Well, speculative fiction, it's somewhat so special, because as what actually being defined here, as what we actually heard, as what I actually read, that speculative fiction, it's about the happenings beyond what are actually exactly on the real world, where we are. So all you have to remember that speculative fiction, it's like going beyond the bar, going beyond the line. So that is actually what we call the speculative fiction. And also for the other genre, we also have here the science fiction. So our sci-fi novels are speculative stories with imagined elements that don't exist in the real world. Some are inspired by hard natural sciences like physics, chemistry, and astronomy. So I will no longer read everything about the science fiction. So all you have to remember that when you actually hear the word science fiction, in short, it's actually called as science. Or I am so sorry. It's actually called as sci-fi. So when you actually hear the word sci-fi, one thing that should come in your mind is that it's actually science fiction. For example, if ever there will be times in your life that you will able to encounter sci-fi, then there will be this someone being asked by another person. Then, for example, you will be asked, "What is sci-fi? Are you familiar with sci-fi?" So then you can say sci-fi. It's just simply stands with the science fiction. So beyond that, science fiction, it's of course that's why it's actually called science. All of the contents, the information or the details within this one are actually related to science, since there are these two classifications of science fiction. We have the hard and also the soft. While the hard science, it pertains to the physics, chemistry, and astronomy. While we talk about soft copies, it somewhat deals with the social sciences, psychology, anthropology, and as well as the sociology. And also, we also have here the fantasy. So fantasy novels are speculative fiction, also stories with imaginary characters set in imaginary universe. So one best example for this is the Once Upon a Time, because aside from the fact that it also goes beyond the bar, it also beyond the usual events that we actually see from in personal. So all of the happenings inside of this fiction are is actually are actually not are actually they tend to be believable even if they are not in personal. So that's why it's actually called speculative, because it goes beyond the bar, it goes beyond the line. Not most, all of the events are actually imaginative. They all came from the imagination of the characters. And not the characters, the author, the one who actually created the fantasy or the story. So all you have to remember that man fantasy, it's all about the imagination, imaginary characters, imaginary events, imaginary themes or lessons that we can actually learn. So fantasy, it's all about things that are actually imaginative, or from our imagination. I'm very much sorry. And also, we also have here the dystopian. I'm not also familiar to this one, so allow me to read. So when we talk about dystopian, it's a genre of science fiction. They are set in societies viewed as worse than the one in which we live. Dystopian fiction exists in contrast to utopian fiction, which is set in societies viewed as better than the one in which we live. So dystopian fiction, it's actually under by the science fiction. So it's all about society. So all you have to remember that when you actually encounter this word, dystopian fiction, it just simply tells us about the society. And since if you can still recall, when maybe you're actually wondering how come that Giancarlo was able to say or to mention that dystopian is also the same with science fiction, and how since dystopian is about society and science fiction is all about more about science, like the universe. So all you have to remember that when you can still recall that under by the science fiction, there is this what we call the science fiction, which actually pertains to the society and so on and so forth. Okay, so I'm very much sorry for the commotion. So allow me to continue. If you can still recall, I was able to mention that there is these two classifications of science fiction. We have here the hard and also the soft. So that's why dystopian is actually Okay, so to continue my discussion, so that's why I was able to mention that dystopian is also connected with science fiction, because there is this one also classification of science, which is actually the science, I mean the soft science fiction, which focuses to the society. Since dystopian, it as well as focuses to the society. That's why they're actually connected to each other. And also for the other genre, we also have here the magical realism. If I'm not mistaken, it's actually the last part. We're already on the 13th of among all those genres that we have. So of course, when we talk about magical realism novels depict the world truthfully, plus add magical elements. So I believe it's already understandable. But when we talk about magical realism, of course, from the term itself, magical, it connects with somewhat in connection with the magic. While we talk about realism, it deals with the reality itself. So magical realism, it talks about the reality or something magical with the reality. So I mean, it talks about the world itself, the world where we actually live, plus with the magical elements. And also, so we are now already on the final destination. I mean, we're already at the finish line of my discussion. So for the last genre among all those 14, we also have here the realist literature. I mean, let me pronounce again the word. It's the realist with the r, with the e, with the a, with the l, with the I, with the I, with the s, and with the t. Okay, so continue my discussion about the realist literature. So simply, realist literature, it depicts real people, it depicts real places, stories, in order to be as truthful as possible. So even though realist literature is actually a kind of fiction, because as what we actually learned previously from the topics that we actually had, that were actually discussed by the reporters previously, or by the former discussion as well. So realist literature, even though it's a kind of fiction, it's just like imaginative, but it actually depicts real people, to make not only people as well as the places, and even the stories, to make to make something more flavorful. So realist literature, in short, even though it's a kind of a fiction, it's a story, it's a genre which is actually a kind of fiction, but still it is trying its best to make bring to bring so much impact, and to make all of the events or that are actually happening in the story believable. So basically, realist literature, it talks about it is also a fiction, wherein it depicts real people, faces, and so on and so forth. So I believe I was able to elaborate already about, I was already be able to discuss about the 14 the literary genre. So I hope you learned something from my discussion for this time, and I believe it's time to say goodbye already. So thank you, and may God bless us all.